All right, everybody doing? Can you hear me all right? Audio good? All right. So we're recording and I'm going to jump right in. If other people come on board, then that's good. So tonight I want to cover something that is relevant, interesting, and kind of non-intuitive, can be complicated. I've had difficulty with it and still am working on it, but it's about predicting the future. So how do we do it and why do we do it and what are some tools that we can use? And this is kind of, can we do it? We can actually, to some degree. We can estimate how things might happen within reason. And but then what we also have to consider then, even if we are able to estimate what we think might happen, what can we do to then influence behaviors today that will then produce the outcomes that we hope to see in the future? All right, so that's the idea that I want to kind of approach today, and it's a lot to cover in about an hour or 45 minutes. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But I'm going to include, we'll get as far as we can go. The key things I want to get across are what are some ways we do it, like look at the future and model it. And what are some ways to model active or influence activities today with levers and then predict what those activities will result in the future. Okay, does that make sense? Particularly economically, and this is why it's useful for those in 560. We're going to talk about discount rates. All right, so I'm going to jump in right into this, and of course there's going to be the notes that go with this that will be useful for you. So the first thing is, well, why do we have to think about it? Why do you think we have to try and predict the future? You're all environmental professionals. Why do you think? Why do you think we need to predict the future, or try to? For future generations to thrive, for sure. Absolutely. Anything else? Any other reasons? Yeah, that's another good one. To anticipate where we should focus our activities today. We also, I mean, ideally, we want future to thrive. I would debate that. I'm not convinced. Like, frankly, if we want future generations to thrive, then we would do things markedly than how we are doing things right now, at least in my opinion. However, to anticipate where we should focus, I think is for sure another reason why we are trying to predict the future, because we want to see what those outcomes are going to look like, and then act accordingly. Okay, but ideally we want to, especially if we're talking sustainable development, is we want to ensure that future generations have a quality of life that is equivalent, if not better, to ours. That's one of the parts of the definition of sustainable development, correct? Does that make sense? Thumbs up. I want to make sure you can hear me. Yeah, okay. So the other thing is we have to think about our future, how we'll be impacted by our current actions. Say if we're deciding on a very practical level, we're deciding on investments and activities today that will influence the future. They're going to impact what the future will look like, and therefore, plain and simple, what will it look like, and what levers do we apply today in order to produce those outcomes in the future? So we have to ask certain questions. For one, what kind of future do the response was we want a good future, right? We want a future where people are, healthy and happy and have a clean environment. But, not everybody necessarily shares that vision, obviously. Some people, and this is the key, is a lot of people would rather benefit today and not think about the impacts in the future, right? Because humans tend to like more instant gratification. That seems to be how we're kind of hardwired to some degree. Not all of us, but a lot of us. Okay. So we need to ask, what kind of future do we want? When do we want that future? Like, when is the future? Is that like 5 years? Is that 10 years from now? Um, how may the actions that we're taking today impact what we will see in the future, right? If we're going to just say, okay, well, we don't need to go renewable. We need to just continue burning coal, right? So how might that affect the future? Well, this is a question. So we need to start at this point. Like, we need to figure out what kind of future we want, what kind of society we want in the future as a planet and as a country and as a community. And then we need to look at what we're doing today and how that might manifest itself in some kind of a future. So the question is, how do we see the future? How do we predict it, or how do we estimate? And this is a challenge, right? Do we use a gut instinct? Like, I kind of think the future is going to be like this. Do we use a crystal ball? Right? I don't know, maybe. But typically, we need to use our best educated guesses. Okay, we need to guess that. We need to make educated guesses and use ways to help us and tools to help us with that. So we have to base this on bodies of knowledge that are most relevant to the issue that we think are going to impact our future, whatever we're dealing with. It could be nutrition, right? It could be disease management. Whatever it is we're thinking about, we need to use the best body of knowledge in order to predict what might happen. Okay? So one way to do that is to model, to use models. So now modeling is always, people say, I hate models, or models freak me out. I get that a lot from people. And the thing is, they don't, because we're using models all the time. Like, constantly we're using models in our own mind. So subconsciously, we're using models on an instantaneous basis. Subconsciously, we are constantly trying to predict the future. Actually, on a second-by-second basis, we're doing predictive modeling. If I do this, then this will happen, right? At a moment, risk that way. And how long has this been going on? Well, it's been going on pretty much from the time our species started to develop. So like, when the missing link was sitting around the campfire, he or she was probably saying, what happens if I touch the fire? Boom, he gets burnt, right? Instantaneously started to develop a mental model, a rudimentary judgment model, but nonetheless still a model, that if I touch something that's kind of warm feeling and looks bright, I'm going to experience pain. And from there, developed a predictive model as to what will happen given certain actions, right? So modeling is not like completely abstract rocket science, weird math. It's actually intrinsic to how we live our lives and how we experience the world on every individual on a second-to-second basis. Okay? But how do we start then, if we're going to use this kind of way of assessing the future to then expand upon our predictive capabilities outside of our own realm of influence? So we first need to figure out what it is we're looking at. Okay, so in our work, it could be we're looking at toxins in the environment. We may be looking at land cover change. We may be looking at the species growth. Or we may be looking at the spread of a virus. There's a lot of different things we want to like predict what might happen given a certain set of circumstances. So the first thing when we're trying to like assess this is we need to determine spatial and temporal constraints, right? So if we're going to try to analyze something, we need to do it over a certain range of space and a certain range of time, right? So it has to be over, is this over a short time period? Is this over a mid-term time period? Is this over a long-term period? Is it just, where are we looking at? Is this just in British Columbia? Is it in a watershed, in a lake? Is it nationally? Is it internationally? So we first need to kind of define spatial and temporal constraints on the situation. And then we have to pick the right tool for that, for what we're looking at, space, and then over what space and what time frame. Those are kind of the three things that we need to like understand right off the bat. Okay, so then there's a bunch of tools that we can choose in order to attempt to predict the future. So there's a wide range of them, and they're suitable for different purposes, and I'm going to go through some of them. But we first need to figure out what we are trying to forecast. And in our work, most of the time, we're trying to forecast or estimate what some type of environmental impact might be. Okay, so it could be, like I said, toxins, it could be the impact of climate change, it could be the spread of an invasive species, whatever it might be. So here are some examples of standard tools for estimating impacts. There's predictive models. For future forecasting, we tend to use predictive models. So a predictive model is a simplified recreation of a system which allows us to run scenarios which reveal different future states of different variables. Now, in order to run predictive models or develop predictive models, we need to have a lot of insight into the situation, usually, a lot of background information. We often will need a lot of data, like baseline conditions, parameters, etc. And then we need to choose kind of what approach we want to take. So for instance, we have mechanistic models that describe different cause and effect relationships. Usually these are quantitative, so for instance, if we're trying to look at the impact of the flow of nutrients into a water body, we'll probably use a quantitative model in which we look at nutrient flow, the dispersion of the pollution, and all that kind of stuff, and then the impact on the biological or ecological community in the lake, like for eutrophication studies. There's also a different type of, like we have deterministic models. So these are based on fixed relationships between different components. Whereas we also have another family of models called stochastic models, which are dependent on relationships between the components, but instead of giving deterministic or fixed outcomes, they tend to give us a range of possibilities, right? So they address random events and give a probability distribution in relation to the outcomes. Okay, so there's a different type of approach. So predictive models, often one example that I've given you is a mass balance model. So this is based on known relationships, and often in our work these will be based on scientific phenomena. So like, say, for instance, hydrological systems or atmospheric systems or kind of energy flow, even you can do that kind of thing. So I'm going to give you a link here. I like this. This is kind of a cute JPEG that I found, which represents a climate model. And I think I've explained this before. That's the leaky bucket or the leaky bathtub model that shows it visually, which is basically we recreate what the atmosphere looks like from an energy standpoint and then attach the math to it. Okay. So those are, we've probably dealt with those a lot. They're based on the known relationships, typically based on laws or formulas, like in terms of climate models and so forth. They are based on the logic of how we understand the climate to work in the atmosphere and sphere. And how so another type of predictive model is known as extrapolation tools. And we're actually seeing a lot of that right now. A lot of use of extrapolation tools in how we're looking at COVID. Okay, so commonly these are referred to as statistical models, and what we tend to do is we extrapolate from data to see what kind of behavior we might expect in another situation. So a really base level example of this, of predicting the future, is through looking at the effect of health of toxins, right? So this can be very straightforward and specific, but then it can get quite complicated. So one classic example is looking at the linear regression between the level of toxins and the amount of deaths or deaths, right? You could say the same thing for, you could look at this linear regression model of the amount of viral load in a room and the amount of infection. You could do a study based on that and then extrapolate that Given the situation, which we know there's this amount of viral load in a room, if someone walks in, they've got like 25% probability of getting COVID-19. That would be an extrapolation model. However, so that's pretty simple, but really when you get in more complicated situations, more variables, you can get like multiple regression models, and it gets quite tricky. Okay, there's another type of way of predicting the future, which are experimental models. So these are when we go and run something in a lab and then try and then project that onto a reality. So the outside world, like again, toxicity. You'd run a toxicity experiment on, say, Daphnia or whatever, and then establish a relationship between the level of toxicity and the amount of Daphnia or microorganisms that die. Okay. Same thing you can look at, and if we look at COVID, we could say, well, we've tested this vaccine on rats and come up with these types of numbers, meaning this vaccine is like 85% successful in reducing the amount of infection rates in a community of, I don't know, 5 rats in this, and done a certain level of runs at that experiment. Your sample size may be 100. But what's the problem with experimental studies? What's a weakness of those studies? It's a question. For instance, if there's a vaccine, they test it in the lab, and then said there's a 95% success rate in reducing infections of COVID-19, and then they gave you a vaccine to go walk in a room, what might you question if you were to walk in that room before you to do that? What would you think? Would you be okay with it? You'd walk in that room with full confidence that that vaccine. Yeah, for one, am I the 1%? Secondly, will it work in the real world? Like what was it? What are these usually tested on? Like how up until now, there's outliers, yeah, animals. There we go. Like, will it work in the real world? I mean, often these vaccines are tested on rats, right? So side effects could be another thing. Oh, the rats are great. They liked it. They got more energetic and they didn't get COVID-19. Well, guess what? We're different than rats. So I would have a lot of questions. I don't think I would want to see a lot of studies, human studies, in order for me to take a vaccine and feel confident with it. I'm not an anti-vaxxer necessarily, but I'm not going to get injected with anything until I see, I'm pretty confident that it's not going to harm me. And it's going to work for what it's supposed to, right? So experimental models are good, but they are not the real world, and we've got to be careful with how those are expected to reflect the real world we're approaching. So another type is analog tools, comparison to one situation to another. Again, so we could look at, if we're looking at, I don't know, the future impacts of climate change in certain regions, we could look at what's happened in one region, then try and use that as an analog to another region, or even in the past. But the problem with analogs, they can be very useful, but at the same time, the thing is, no two situations are identical, right? They're not always the same. There's always going to be some sort of kind of influence of local context, culture, biophysical conditions, whatever. So you analog tools can be used, but again, you have to look at them, say, well, what is this a valid comparison? So we have to be careful because, another good example is think of how we are comparing how different countries responded to COVID-19, right? Like it's hard to compare Brazil to Italy, or another place, or Sweden to Canada. Why? Because we're not the same. There's a lot of variables that differ between the situations. Could be population density, could be demographics, could be economics. There's many different things that would influence those kind of analog side-by-side comparisons. So again, you have to be careful with analog studies. They're not going to always give you the right answer. Judgment tools. Now these rely on input of professionals. So this is where you get a bunch of pros together and they kind of predict how the future might look like based on their experience and knowledge. It's a really interesting one because I think it's underestimated the importance of this, and it's underutilized in my opinion. Tacit knowledge is very important. So tacit knowledge is like embedded knowledge that you have. Now, so to give you an example, those from 586 that are on this, think about traditional ecological knowledge. Now, how many modeling studies do you know that have been done in collaboration with First Nations people? I don't know many actually. I've come to think of it, I can't think of one that I've read in which they ran the climate models and so forth, and then they also had, a roundtable discussion with, traditional elders who've lived on the land for millennia, right? Whereas that would be an important thing. And so this is where judgment tools come into play. Sometimes wisdom wins. Like I've seen a lot of modelers and worked with a lot of them. And frankly, sometimes wisdom wins over the most complicated of models. So one example, and I've mentioned this before, is the Delphi technique, where it's more of a systematized approach to doing judgment assessments, where you get a few different experts together and you run through a survey in which they give their input and then iterate through that until you finally come to what these experts collectively think might happen given a certain situation. The link to a step-by-step guide to application of the Delphi technique. Another example is scenario tools. So hypothetical situation created to focus attention on key decision-making points. So, and they did this with the Millennium Assessment. So you create kind of a scenario in which you think is going to happen, and then you analyze different key points in decision making to assess why things went in a certain direction. Now, this is kind of like, I don't know if you've ever read those choose your own adventure books. I remember when I was a kid, they had those where, you read a bit and it says, if you do this, you go to this page, and if you do this, you go to this page. I mean, that's classic. It's a scenario you're creating by the narrative you're following, right? But there's decision-making points along that story that create that storyline or that narrative, which is essentially a scenario. So this is one way of kind of creating a story of the future. Another way of doing this is reversing that. So rather than going forward through the story, you backcast through the story. So you start with the desired future outcome. So back to Michelle's point, she said, like, look, we want to have a future where our generations 100 years from now can prosper, right? Or having healthy and prosperous lives, right? So we start there in the future at 100 years, and we paint what that looks like. We could say, okay, well, this means that they've got zero pollution, they've got energy in abundance, plenty of blah, blah, blah. And then from there, you kind of backcast. You work your way back to where we're at today, and then outline certain decision-making points along that time trajectory, which will then, in fact, result in that future. And if you do the Millennium Assessment, you'll see that they painted four different scenarios in which the future of humanity. Yeah, so you plan for the future that you want. So go to the Millennium Assessment, actually, the summary, I think they have that in the decision-making summary. I think they do, I'm not sure. It's in there though. And they paint different futures based on policy decisions today. And one is like called the Techno Garden. One is, I forget the other. One's more of a command and control, which is like, states are more authoritative and so forth and less pluralistic. But they had these different scenarios that were the future. Like, this is what the future will look like given that we do this, right? And then obviously some of those futures were a little more environmentally healthy and others were less environmentally healthy. So they did a really interesting job of kind of creating those narratives and then tying that into the scientific work that they did. Okay, so scenarios is pretty good. Shell's done a lot of work in scenario. The company Shell did a lot of work in scenarios. In fact, Shell was famous for scenario work back in like the 80s and 90s. Like they were like the ones that were way out ahead of everybody. They had a group where I'll put that into the notes. Really, Shell was famous for this. And today is really good. I mean, Shell's got tremendous people working for them in environmental applications. Type 5 is spatial tools. So this is where you can use GIS, so Geographic Information Systems. This is stuff I work on a lot, to determine spatial impacts or distribution. So this is, I mean, I love GIS and remote sensing because I've done a lot of it, and I see the power of it when you know how to use it. And it's a great way of looking at the spatial distribution of impacts or policies even. And you can combine that with process modeling. So it's not just about one-off, like we're going to do the spatial assessment at this time, this time, this time, this time. You can run process models, which are, as previously defined, based on relationships between defined relationships between variables, and that will then result in outcomes, right? So this model says, okay, this is what's going to happen, but you can run process models with geospatial output. So this is what a climate model is. It's a process model that when you run it, the outcome of that is a spatial distribution, certain temperature, precipitation, sea surface temperature, land cover, etc., etc. So the benefit of spatial tools is they're very easy to visualize for most people. Most people really understand maps and appreciate maps and can understand it, whereas it's not as understandable when you have your model output being a graph, like of two variables that graphed against each other or what have you. People it is harder to explain that to people often. So those are some tools, and there's more, but those are some kind of key ones, at least that I've encountered and used. And the next step, once you've established what modeling approach you're going to take, when you develop it and you apply it and so forth, is to test it, is to see how well this model, this way of looking at the future, is going to accurately reflect what's going to go down. So there's two main principles here. The first is accuracy, and the second is precision. So accuracy is how much the actual effects differed from predicted effects. So is your model accurate, right? It's like bang on. We said there's going to be this many parts per million of VOCs in the atmosphere based on this spill, and bang, we hit it exactly that. And then the other part of that is precision. Okay, and precision is the degree of exactness of the predictions, right? So the model that I just told you is accurate, and it's also precise because we're dealing with really specific things. Whereas not all models are like that, and this is where you have to be careful with models when you see them. Say, well, let's see how precise that model is. I mean, they say it's accurate, but let's see the precision in which they're running that. And here's an example of an accurate yet imprecise model. It will be kind of rainy tomorrow in Vancouver. Okay, that's my prediction. That's my model, right? So it's probably accurate. I actually don't know if it's accurate for tomorrow, but on any given day in the winter, that's going to be probably a pretty accurate prediction in Vancouver if you spent any time in the city. Whereas, is it very precise? Not really. I mean, kind of rainy, what does that mean? Does that tell me how many millimeters of rain are going to fall? No, it just tells me it's a general atmospheric condition. So we have accurate, sure, precise, no, not really. So we need to determine then the level of precision used in prediction with the severity of the importance of the outputs. So if we're dealing with something that we need quite high precision, then we need to make sure that is built into that model, that our model is precise. So when we are accurate, we are like on it. And a good example of this would be when we're dealing with, an infectious disease or a highly toxic substance or something like that, where the consequences can be quite high if the output is off by a small amount. Okay, so that's an important distinction: accuracy versus precision, and how they excuse me. So those are like some kind of characteristics of modeling and how we might want to approach it in any given situation. And I will include these notes are going to be available for you. So what do we need this for? So what is something that we need this for today? What's an example of how we might want to model and then predict the future? Boom. Yes. Climate adaptation is one. Anything else? I have a hard time with assuming something in the future. It was predicted great economic sustainability, but nobody counted. Exactly. Exactly. This is the paradox of predicting the future. This is why a lot of people can be somewhat nihilistic about it, right? There are events that are not predict, right? There's there's biophysical stuff that's actually can be quite predictable, and then there are human events that are wildly irrational, um, and therefore difficult to predict. So this is where, I mean, in fact, this can be a whole different discussion, and this speaks to what we covered a lot in 586, which is, building resilience. And this, I would say, in fact, Julio, is a great segue into the importance of a resilience mindset if we're going to be somewhat capable to withstand whatever's thrown at us in the future, right? And what is resilience? Like, how would you define it? Someone, preferably from 586. You should know this. Resilience. What is it? Ability to adapt and maintain its function, more or less. The recovery from damages to absorb changes in variables and maintain the desired state. So you define a state. So let's say our state is we want a healthy economy, healthy society, and a pristine environment, right? 3 pillars of sustainable development. Loosely speaking, this is just, we want society to be intact, social order, cohesion. We want economic activity to be, vibrant. And let's be real about it. I know we're environmental people, but look at what happens when you have an economic downturn. Things go sideways, right? So it's important to have economic sustainability. And we want a pristine environment. I think that's generally speaking, a safe statement for a desired state. So resilience then would be, we want to be able to absorb shocks in variables that are going to impact that state, right? So what might impact human health? Well, for instance, a viral infection might be something. Um, Malnutrition, lack of food. Another thing, lack of water. What could impact economic activity? Well, a recession or economic downturns or what have you. And environmental issues, environmental collapses, right? Massive changes in ecosystems, pollution, deforestation, droughts, disasters, and so forth. So a resilience mindset allows us or gives us the motivation to think about how we can sustain impacts if they are to come and still maintain the desired state that we are seeking. Generally speaking, that's a social and ecological resilient framework. The point, which is, I have trouble predicting the future. Well, that's because we can't predict the future. Things will happen. And one of the principles or fundamental aspects of a resilience mindset is to be prepared for surprise, right? Because things happen, and they happen in our own personal lives, and they happen in society, and they happen globally, like this pandemic, that, they just happen. Surprise, guess what? We're having a global pandemic. And so how do we then be resilient to these things? Now, we'd have to look at that and say, well, we can become more resilient to pandemics in the future if what? Have enough PPE, we have a medical system that's robust enough to deal with it, all that kind of stuff, right? So, but that doesn't mean we cannot still try to predict how things might happen in the future, and because we have to, right? It's part of our jobs as environmental professionals. So, climate change and carbon. Back to one of the examples, Sarah's point. Climate adaptation, absolutely. This is a perfect example of where we want to attempt to predict the future and use some levers in order to better prepare for a future that we might experience, right? It's a classic case. So we're faced with a situation with climate change where future conditions can actually be influenced by actions that we take today, correct? Like we can change the future if we do certain things today. So this is a perfect example of where we want to use our modeling mindset and our future prudent mindset. So the first thing we have to figure out is what kind of model, back to like what are models, what do we need to use, right? So what would we want to use in order to try and predict the future when it comes to climate change? What kind of model? We could use multiple actually. I'll show you one that's often used. Yeah, predictive model. Definitely. So, and in this case, biocentric, not, I mean, I guess in a way, but it's in this case, with climate models, you could probably classify it as a stochastic model, as of the ones that I described. I mean, it's deterministic in some ways, but there's a lot of randomness and there's a lot of variability that's built into this problem. And stochastic models give you, although the engine behind a lot of climate models is based on physical science. It's based on if there's this much emissions in the atmosphere, then this is what will happen, with feedback between the biosphere and so forth. So here is a model, okay, that would advise you use in Canada. I went over this last time in the climate change adaptation. So this is an actual kind of climate model that's going to give you what the estimated impact of climate change is going to be over in the future, right? Okay. So that's the website. I mean, that's actually just the source website. You might want to explain this. You might want to use a model that is less about predictive and showing the actual outputs of estimated variables, temperature, precipitation, whatever. And you might want to say, this is what it might look like. Okay. So this is one on the same platform that is called the Climate Atlas. And this is more narrative. It talks about climate impacts in different parts of Canada with video and so forth. But say, like, if you're going to work with a community and say, look, this is what the future might look like, and this is what we're experiencing now, the Climate Atlas is a good model to show the visual kind of storyline behind what the impact of climate change might be. And then the actual model itself, predictive models say, okay, we're looking at a range between X and Y, percent increase or decrease, well, increase in temperature in this region. You would use this part of it, which is the climate data part of the Environment Canada Climate Change portal platform, okay? And these various tools within Canada will allow us to see the future, right? We can see what the temperature might look like based on, a pretty credible biophysical model. Or we can see what the story might look like in this community based on, someone's interpretation of that, who's in the climate. But that allows us to see what the future might look like. Now we can also combine that model with other output. So like in the case of climate adaptation, we might want to look at what is the geographical impact of greater like what will the land cover look like based on this kind of distribution of new temperatures. So you then add to that a geographic element and start to look at land cover, maybe look at infrastructure and so forth. And this is really important when you're planning investment decisions as a country or what have you for say, planning agriculture or planning infrastructure for coastal protection or becoming more resilient to storms, the stuff that I deal with in the Caribbean. So in that case, you're going to have the climate model output, but you're also going to have some of the biophysical conditions of the place and then infrastructure on top of that. And you use GIS to do that. Literally, you get one layer, which is all the infrastructure, one layer, which is all land cover, and then one layer, which is climate model output, maybe at, I don't know, 4 different increments, 2020, 2050, 2100, and 100. Have those on layers, one on top of each other. And you could see then what the temperature future would look like given, different. That's one way to kind of see the future. But how do we use levers then to change this future, right? This is the point of looking to the future. Sometimes you want to reach a desired outcome, like I was saying before. A scenario is to like envision the future we want and how do we work back? Well, if we have a model that gives us a pretty good idea of where we're going based on current behaviors, then we have some options because we know that that model gives us output for business as usual with this policy, this policy, this policy. So we can work back. We say, well, we want this one. We want to be at, I don't know, a certain temperature below 2 degrees or something like that. So then we have to work back to determine what is going to be required in order to realize that future. And in order to do that, we need to use levers, or another word for that is to use policy instruments. Okay? So what is an example of that if we're talking about climate change? What's an example of a lever or a policy instrument? Yes, carbon taxation. Carbon tax is one. What's another one? A lever, something we can implement, which is going to impact this one thing we're concerned about, which are greenhouse emissions and the future reality that will be created as a result of them being emitted. What's another lever? Carbon tax is one. That's an economic disincentive. So you're penalizing. Lever, afforestation, sure, you could say that. And the lever would be there. A lever, I'm saying, is like something you apply. Like in a policy that you'd implement. So carbon tax is something you apply to society in order to change people's behavior to realize a future that you want. Right? So afforestation would be something that we would, we want to encourage afforestation, so creation of new forests in order to reduce greenhouse gases. Julio, new energy sources, right. So the lever there would be, so how do we incentivize new energy sources to be created? We could say, well, let's provide a subsidy for wind, energy, so forth. Recycling costs, again, it's another way of, recycling is a positive incentive. So you're paying people to recycle. That encourages an environmental behavior, right? Change in transportation options, new bike lanes, electric cars. Sure. So those, again, are other levers. You would then implement, say, when you create more options for transportation, like electric cars, we have in BC the discount for, you get a rebate for electric cars, right? It's a lever. Bike lanes, that's kind of a social, we could put in a policy when we want to spend on bike lanes with the hope that people will ride more bikes, and that it's been shown to be true. Same with taxation on traffic taxation. That works tremendously well. Like taxes work really effectively. In London, they put a tax on like a tariff on cars coming into Greater London. So you had to pay to come in with a car. And guess what? People started to find different options for getting into London. Better sustainability education. Yes, exactly. That's a good one. That's a generic one. That's the one that we, we hope that that results in more, and better behaviors or better decisions from an environmental standpoint, and usually it does. Circular economy, right? Incentives for circular economy for companies, right? You can put a lever in place in like an industrial benefit, and the government, Canadian government's actually really good for this. There's a lot of different levers, so many of them actually that it's hard to keep track of them. Plastic waste reduction, producer responsibility, all of those are good. Emissions limits, that's another one. So there's carbon taxation, which is an economic disincentive, but then there's emissions targets or limits, which is just, that's another approach, which is cap and trade. So you cap it, and then if you are going to exceed your limits, you have to then buy carbon credits, and carbon credits would be part of that cap and trade system. So there we go. I mean, there's a lot of different kind of things that we can do to influence the future, right? There's so many. It's crazy of different things. So if any of you are ever in a position, like a management position or whatever, any kind of like place where you can inform rules and guidelines, think of things like this, like what are the levers that we can implement that are going to give incentives for environmentally beneficial behavior? That's what we want. We want to incentivize sustainable behavior and disincentivize unsustainable behavior. That's classic environmental economics, right? So taxation on emissions is a disincentive for unsustainable behavior, and a rebate for purchasing an electric car in a place like British Columbia or Manitoba or Quebec, where you have, low carbon, positive incentive for environmentally beneficial behavior, right? Carrot and stick type of stuff. Okay, but modeling is key here though, because the modeling gives you kind of the analytical framework to work with. If you don't know what the future is you want, you have no way of determining what levers you want to implement in order to get there. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Like, you have to have some sort of vision, strategy, and predictive capability of some sort. And Julio's point is very valid in that we can't predict the future. So we have to build in for resilience too, to say, look, we have this future plan, we have positive incentives for environmental benign behavior, we have disincentives for unsustainable behavior, but if the crap hits the fan, we've also got this, I don't know, maybe a contingency fund of some sort. We've got a lot of PPE stored, all this kind of stuff that we might need for the response to these kind of disturbances. Okay? So, so we have all these levers, and we need to have these instruments, and one of these is pricing. So, as mentioned, one is to put a price on emissions. And in order to do this, this is very tricky. Like, how do you get the right price? Well, the key is we have to experiment in order to get this right. Like we don't, and it's an iterative process. Like you can say, what's a fair price for bananas, right? Well, I mean, it's going to change 5 years from now, and it will change based on the current market conditions, change in the social and cultural fabric of a society will influence what a fair price for banana is. The supply of bananas will influence it. There's a lot of factors that will change over time. So there's no steady state, fixed in time, correct answer to what is the right price for emissions. That's the key. Some people are really dogmatic about this stuff and they're like digging their heels. It's like, well, this is always changing. So, we got to kind of appreciate the nuance associated with it. So we have to experiment to get it right. And how do we do that? Okay, so the last concept I'm going to leave you with tonight from a modeling standpoint is an important one, and it's particularly important for those 560, which is the idea of a discount rate. So who knows what a discount rate is? Accounting for future costs, yes. It's a means by which you can account for what an interest rate is? I hope you all do. Of course you know what an interest rate. Does anybody have a mortgage? Yes, you do. Some of you do. So there you go. You know what an interest rate is. Interest rate and discount rates are very similar. In fact, they're like the inverse principle, basically. An interest rate is estimating what something is a rate that will determine what a dollar today will be worth in the future, right? That's kind of the essence of what an interest rate is, correct? With your investments and your RSPs and all that kind of stuff. Whereas a discount rate is the opposite of that. It's determining what the present value of a future cost is. Okay, it's a means by calculating that. Okay? Does that make sense? It's looking to the future, which is what we've been trying to do with all these explanations, climate models and predictive models and all that kind of stuff, and determining, okay, in the future, it's going to be like this. But let's kind of rewind to the present and then try and connect the present to the future. But in this case, we're trying to do it with a lever, which is emissions costing. Okay, and in order to do that, in order to deal with anything where we're having to kind of like estimate future benefits based on present day actions, you have to look at the discount rate. Okay? So it's essentially, by definition, is the rate at which society as a whole is willing to trade off present for future benefits. So we're going to trade off the present benefit for future benefits. And this is often used when weighing the decision to undertake a project with long-term benefits. So say, for instance, if you're going to implement green technology or a wetland conservation or whatever, versus one with shorter-term benefits and long-term costs. So, for example, if we're going to protect this wetland in order to, I don't know, encourage carbon sequestration over the long term, or we can say, nah, let's just log all around the forest, and it's going to have impacts on carbon sequestration over the long term, but we're going to get the logs. Is this used for cash flow presently? I mean, you can use it then for, you know, present cash flow. Like, you have to make that decision, right? In this case here, in the case about, like, let's just say we have some land that's got a wetland on it with a bunch of forests, right? We say, okay, well, just based on the way that we're going, and I just ran an environmental accounting course at Roads, so I know that, you know, increasingly, this whole thing about environmental credits and emissions credits and so forth is growing, and I'm sitting on a place that has a lot of ecological value, right? And I could hang on to it and start to kind of like look at how I could turn my land into some sort of ecological bank, which will be like sequestering carbon for the next 100 some odd years, right? And actually attach cash flow to that. Like we will be able to do that. Or I could say, gosh, I'm broke. You know, this COVID thing has really messed me up. I've got no revenue coming in. And I've got a bunch of trees on my forested land here. And I've got this, you know, developer down the road that's building a new mansion, and they need some wood, and they'll give me X dollars now for that wood, right? So I'm confronted with the situation of getting whatever it is cash-wise right today, tomorrow, to pay my bills or do whatever I want, versus the long-term benefit of conserving land and turning it into an ecological bank. Does that make sense? There's a future benefit that's over the long term, but there's also immediate benefits you can garner. And this is particularly useful when you look at these situations. Brazil is a great example where you have a farmer that says, look, I can cut down my trees here in the southern part of the Amazon, I'm on Mato Grosso or Rondonia or a place like that. I'm going to take all this land I have now, I'm going to cut all down the trees, I'm going to get a bunch of cows, I'm going to grow some soya and have a soya cow plantation, right? And in 2 years, or not even, like the cows grow pretty quickly, I'm going to have the cows are like going to be ready for market, and some of them are going to be ready in a couple years or a year, maybe less, I don't know. And I'm going to have cash flow then. Whereas, on a longer term basis, I can also think about this as a long term play. Say, look, I'm more concerned over the long term. I want to conserve this land. I'm going to call, Dave in Canada, and he's going to come down here and, work with me to set up this land as a conservation area. And we will then monitor it and sequester carbon and get paid maybe like a fraction of the amount that I would get in that 2 years, but I would get that cash flow over starting in 5 years, and it would last for let's say it's 25 years, right? Based on carbon sequestration per year. So you're faced with the decision of, okay, present value and then future benefit, but what are the present costs of it? And you have to look at each one of these situations indifferently, but you always need to have a discount rate. That's an whether or not it's worth it for you to take the short-term gain or sit it out for the long term. Okay? So for feasibility studies, your discount rate's like one of the critical variables that you're going to be using. So the discount rate is an extremely important role in determining the outcome of the analysis. And many things, like say net present value, benefit cost ratio, internal rate of return, rate on investment, they depend on the discount rate that you've chosen, much like you choose your interest rate. So why do we need discount rates then? Because a dollar received today is considered more valuable than one received in the future, often, right? A bird in the, how do you say? A bird in the bucket, what is that thing where you have a bird in the hand is worth three in the bush, right? Same thing, that's it. That's what it means. I've got a bird in my hand, I've got a dollar in my pocket. That's worth more to me than three in the bush, because I don't know in the future if I'll have those dollars. And so why? Because we don't know. Like sometimes there's uncertainty associated with the future. So there's 4 reasons for applying a positive discount rate. Positive rates of inflation diminish the purchasing power of dollars over time. Okay. Today, a positive return. Thirdly, there's uncertainty surrounding the ability to obtain promised future income. There's a risk that a future benefit may never be realized. So for instance, back to your land issue with the forest, I mean, if you've got a buyer today for your forest and you know that tomorrow they will buy that land, buy the lumber, fine, you're ready to go. Whereas, are you certain that 10 years from now you're going to have a buyer for the greenhouse gas sequestration, the carbon sequestration? Well, maybe policies change. Maybe, I don't know, maybe things, who knows what's going to happen in the future? You might not have that opportunity in the future, right? So there's some uncertainty there. So humans are generally also, the last issue with discount rates is that humans are generally impatient and preferred instant gratification over waiting for the long-term benefits. What if the incentive is equal to what the farmer earns monthly for instead, and they will not need to convert it into, okay, good question. What if the incentive is equal to what the farmer earns monthly? So the incentive, okay, so if the incentive, you're saying the incentive for conservation is equal to what the farmer earns monthly from, say, cattle production, okay. Well, I mean, that would be an interesting question, because if the economics are the same, like, then you'd have to introduce there'd be some other considerations, right? So if the value is the same, there might be some difference in risk, right? So back to the cattle one, and I love the cattle example because, it's a perfect example of liquidity. Agriculture is risky. I don't know if any of you are farmers or have ever worked on a farm, but it's risky business, right? You may not have a good season, right? So your liquidity issue, there's a lot of factors that go into farming. So in that farmer's example, like going from soya to market, there's a lot of things that might influence that transaction. There's a lot of risk, right? It may be a bad season, the weather might suck, the market might collapse, and so forth. Whereas in cattle, cattle is notoriously very stable. You know, they've got a pretty consistent demand for meat, and it's easily liquidated. You're easy to liquidate. So one needs to discourage this type of behavior. Yeah. So that's where I think education plays a role, and that's where values play a role. We say, look, I mean, and confidence and capacity. So as people become more attuned to these ideas, and it's taken a long time for avoided deforestation to catch on, and payment for ecosystem services, it still hasn't come on. But it's only because projects have started to become successful and bankable that you're seeing more of them. But and a big part of that is education and capacity development. So the economics may work out perfectly and say that you take care of risk, you get a good insurance, right, for your agriculture, your crops, and you're covered. Even still, like there's a component which will be about values. What do people want in the future? Do you want to conserve forest and keep an intact ecosystem that's, you know, you know, we want to encourage kind of sustainable behavior, or do we want to encourage the status quo behavior? And that is, you know, that's where economics may not play a role. I think there always needs to be greater incentive for these things. So you need to be the greater incentives for people. Look at electric cars, right? There are tremendous incentives in Vancouver for getting electric cars. In fact, they've dialed back the incentives for electric cars because they were getting, you know, overutilized. And in fact, it's very interesting. There's been some studies that have been done, one of which is with a guy from UBC, where they've looked at, you know, incentives were so great for electric cars that they didn't make sense, you know, because people that were going to buy the electric cars would have bought them anyway without incentive. You know, they were going to go buy a Tesla with or without the incentive. So therefore, the cost to society was greater for that policy than it needed to be. Do you understand? Like particularly with high valued cars. That's why when you look at the incentives for electric cars, there's no incentives for cars that are priced over, I think, 60,000 or 50,000. So you can't get a Model S or a Model X Tesla car with an incentive, right? Like if you look on the line, you can't find that. If you want to get a Model X, you pay full price. Why? Because if you can afford that car, you're probably going to buy it anyway. That's the rationale. And therefore, any incentive for that is a misappropriation of public funds. That's the conclusion that came out of the early stages of electric vehicle incentives, which is quite funny actually when you think about it. All right, so yes, these are really good questions about the role of incentivization and also how these things interact together. But there are certain things like a discount rate is an important thing to be able to use. I think all of us would like to have the forest functioning, isn't it? Yeah, for sure. But you know what? Like, you're in a situation with the tragedy of the commons. If you're the landowner and you're in Brazil and you're faced with revenue of like millions of revenue, it's economy versus environment versus economy, and also the tragedy of the commons comes into play there. What's more valuable, your own personal gain or common good? Right? And what is one way of overcoming the tragedy of the commons? This is a classic. Elinor Ostrom, who developed the idea of the tragedy of the commons, posited that one of the main ways of overcoming the tragedy of the commons is through what? Starts with C. How do people come to terms with making their own individual decisions versus the public good, and perhaps might make decisions that would be in the greater good as opposed to their own individual benefit? How do you close, very close, 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 very close, closer? The root word is good. It's your root word is there. COM, and fill in the rest of the word. It's not communism. There we go, communication. Communication amongst the different stakeholders so that people understand. And in fact, like with climate change is a good example because people have become more attuned now to the global threat to commons. Very evidence to most people. Even far-right conservatives now can understand the collective impact of a lack of action on climate change right now due to the impact of many of the weather events that have occurred. Look at Calgary, not saying that we can link that directly, but there's a higher frequency of these events happening. Okay? Communication is back to the point that Julio had raised, which is, well, how do we encourage collective action on the commons, which is functioning forests? Well, the landowner needs to know that they've got another option, and that other option that they will take, if it's economically suitable enough for them, if they're incentivized, will be much better off for the commons. And you'd be surprised, but some groups aren't aware of these factors, right? And this is partially your job, to make people aware of this stuff. All right, I've got to finish up. So what do you calculate this discount rate? Well, there is a calculation for determining the present value based on a future value. Okay, so here's a situation. So we have this is a benefit situation. So we have a future benefit of salmon habitat restoration will result. So this investment today is going to result in an expanded catch in the future of valued at around 10 million US dollars in 10 years. That's what we expect. Okay, so how do then we calculate then the present value of that future benefit? Okay, see the, and this is how you do it, much like an interest rate. So this is the present value equals the future value divided by 1 plus the interest rate times the number of years. Okay, so if this is a present value of 10 million, or sorry, a future value of 10 million US for the catch, and we're going to assume a discount rate of 3%, let's say 3, and it is over 10 years. Okay, there's a calculation, and that will give us then this, which will result in this. Okay, so that's a very rough analysis of how you would use a discount rate to calculate the present value of a future benefit. So if we want to see that future benefit of a $10 million catch from salmon, this is the type of investment we could justify making today in order to make that happen, assuming a discount rate of 3%. All right, that's a very basic calculation of how you would use this in future predicting. Like, here's our prediction, and you'd have models to predict that catch and so forth. This is where the modeling makes sense. But the discount rate is going to heavily influence whether or not you would make that investment. So the present value is going to vary quite widely based on the discount rate that you use. So if we use a 10% discount rate, the present value of that would be 3.85 would be this, be about 4 million. That's at a 10% discount rate. It's a 48% reduction in present value benefits. So high discount rates tend to discourage projects that generate long-term benefits, like a wetland restoration, and favor those that create short-term benefits and significant long-term costs. So it's kind of like you want to think about the inverse from interest rates. Through a discount rate is like an inverse of compound interest. So whereas compounding measures and the same kind of idea then applies to greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, and I'm going to conclude this And I'm going to give you some literature to look at, so you need to kind of process this stuff, right? Because this is a very simple example of one action in a constrained environment with relatively predictable outcomes in the future, right? And with changing the discount rate, you can see, okay, well, this is the difference between, the future benefit times in relation to a present value. Now, climate change is different because the way discount rates play a role in climate change is we use them for trying to dictate how much action should be taken, the cost of action today, in order to avoid future costs. Okay? So rather than future benefits, well, it is a future benefit if you're reducing the cost. But the idea with the discount rate and climate change is to look at, well, we expect there to be, given the model output, like so we start to look at the climate models we've used for what I've shown you, the climate action stuff. Say, well, if we are going into business as usual, we're going to have this amount of increase in temperature over the next in 2050 we're going to be at this level, and at 2100 we're going to be at this level, right? So that's going to give you the actual expected reality that we will be in, right? An increase in 2.1, 2.3 degrees Celsius temperature. And therefore, then you attach then what are some of the costs that are associated with that, right? So that may be floods, it may be higher frequency of storms, it may be impact on agriculture. You have to look at what are the estimated costs, which are quite significant. Okay, you see where I'm going with this? So you have a cost in the future that is expected to materialize as a result of climate change, which is resulting from the compounding effect of social actions from today into the future. And therefore, then we have to then look at, okay, well, what can we do then to encourage actions to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions today in order to then reduce those costs in the future, right? This is the focus of economics, climate change. Okay, so assessing climate change impacts and mitigation policies, it involves the comparison of economic flows that occur in different points of time. And the discount rate is used to compare economic effects at these different times. And by discounting, the discounting process converts future economic impacts into their present day value. And we tend to use a positive discount rate because if we invest those resources today, we can transform those into more resources later on in the future, right? Like an interest rate. So the thing is, with the discount rate, we have to look at the discount rate to apply. So this is where we need to study it a bit. So we need to read some literature about the costs. So what are the estimated costs in the future? And, what might they be? How credible are those estimates and so forth? And then you have to look at the choice of the discount rate to make sure that it is set at the right kind of level in order to encourage an adequate amount of mitigation actions today in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that will then result in less impacts in the future. Okay? And I will include a couple of key papers that I think will be useful for you in the notes to look deeper into this, because I can only explain so much in the short period of time. So the choice of the discount rate has a large effect on the result of any climate change cost analysis. So if you use too high of a discount rate, it will result in too little investment in mitigation, like too little investment in mitigation today. Whereas if we use too low of a rate, it will result in too much mitigation. So in other words, a high discount rate implies that the present value of $1 is worth more than the future values of $1, and vice versa. Okay, so we have to set it at the right level such that the future value of reductions is worth giving up the money today to invest in mitigation. Does that make sense? And it will make more sense when I send you these two papers. There's two people that I think you should read if you're interested in this. Two seminal, they've kind of been the main people. There's more, but the key ones are a guy named Nordhaus, who started this whole kind of process of trying to cost what action today will result in the fix we want to see in the future. So Nordhaus was one of the early thinkers in this area. Okay, have you heard of Nordhaus before? Some of you have. His paper will be in this. So Nordhaus is one. And who's the other one? And they argue. It's comical. Nordhaus is a little more libertarian, I would say, or more kind of market oriented, I guess you could say. Like less intrusive and more like, okay, well, let's look at the behavior. Because one of Nordhaus's issues is you need to make it cost competitive, right, in the current market conditions. So if someone's going to invest in mitigation, why don't they just invest that money in, like, I don't know, index funds or something like that? It needs to have, you need to account the opportunity cost of investing today versus the benefits. Like, he factors that in. So he's a little more descriptive. The other person that is one of the key kind of voices in this is a guy named Stern, Nicholas Stern. Have you ever heard of Stern before? Yeah, so the Stern report was written, I guess, a while ago now, probably in the 2006 or 7, I think. I forget, maybe even 5, or somewhere between 2005 and 2010. So, and Stern argues that you need to be more prescriptive, a little more kind of like forcing action with a prescribed discount rate. Okay. So, to summarize then, in conclusion, to see the future and predict the future and influence the future, we need to have a model. We need to have a way of seeing the future that is somewhat credible, somewhat based on sound judgment. It could be science, could be economics, it could be judgment. I've described some different tools that we can use. Now, if we want to influence the future that we hope to see, the scenario, then we can use certain levers or certain means of influencing behavior that help us to kind of get to that future. One of which is interest rates or discount rates for emissions. One of it is costing things. And for those in 560, this is costing any environmental externality. It could be water quality, it could be biodiversity, it could be forests, but in this case, we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. And then finding the right kind of outcome that we want, say in terms of mitigation actions, and then putting the prices in that will create the behavior that we want to see that will get us to that future, okay? But with one, we can't have the other. Like, you need a model in order to kind of anticipate what the future might look like. And then underlying all of that is this need to be anti-fragile or resilient, to kind of cope with and deal with the bumps along the road, right? And we've just had a big bump with COVID-19, or in the middle of a big bump, and there will be more. Like, there'll be COVID-19s. There's going to be disasters. There's going to be all kinds of stuff, So we have to then, as an underlying kind of blanket, to some degree, adopt the precautionary principle and expect to be surprises and be resilient enough in social, environmentally, and economic ways to not have those bumps totally shift off a path and convert us into another undesirable state. as a society, whether we're looking at the community level, the provincial level, the federal level, or globally. All right? There you go. Any questions? Is that clear as mud? We've gone through like about like 2 university courses, if not more, in an hour. So I don't expect it to be pretty like totally absorbed. Good links that will allow you to kind of dig deeper into this idea of a discount rate, an idea into what models do what, climate models and so forth, and just to think about this stuff. I guarantee you that this will be useful to you. Good. All right. So unless there's any other questions, I will sign off for the night. 560, we'll talk tomorrow. And everybody else, we'll talk at some other time. I will have to change the time for tomorrow. I will send her a note. I have a meeting at 5. It'll have to be earlier, so I'll send a note. Okay, well, thank you for coming out, and I hope this was useful.